Even though the Falcons keep collecting bad play callers, they're hoping that they have the last laugh.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code Locked On, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. If you do not know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we'll be breaking into our positional reviews on the defensive side of the ball, starting with the edge rushers. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about James Pearce and Jaylen Walker's very productive rookie seasons and impactful rookie seasons and where they can go from here, as well as the rest of the edge rusher room. But we'll start today's episode with talking about the air quotes big hire that the Falcons made this past Saturday, which is they hired a new passing game coordinator in Tanner Engstrand, the former Jets offensive coordinator in 2025, as well as the former passing game coordinator under Ben Johnson with the Detroit Lions for several years. And, my understanding of Tanner Engstrand was that he was the guy that the Lions were expecting to replace Ben Johnson should he have left at any point in the last previous 2 off seasons. And unfortunately, he got hired away once Aaron Glenn went to New York and got stolen away from that. And that left the Lions a little bit in a lurch, but not too much because we'll talk about it later. They were still a very effective offense without that. But the year in New York for Tanner Engstrand probably should have second-guessed that decision. Did not go well for him. The Jets offense struggled. They finished 29th in EPA this past year, according to True Media. They were 30th in DVOA. On offense, according to FT and Fantasy, 31st in passing, 27th in rushing. And we heard some of the concerns about Tanner Engstrand when we did the crossover episode with John Bushko of Locked On Jets earlier this season. He talked quite a bit in that episode about the utilization of Breece Hall. It would be easy to give Engstrand a pass for the poor performance of the Jets offense, given the limitations of the Jets personnel, particularly at the quarterback position, similar to how people have given Tommy Rees a pass for the poor performance of the Browns offense, and same thing with Kevin Stefanski. But when you look at the Jets personnel, it's hard for me to give Engstrand too much of a pass, right? In terms of not necessarily maximizing the usage, right? If you were looking at this Jets offense, you're like, okay, they don't have a lot going for them, but they have 3 things going for them reasonably. It's Breece Hall, it's Justin Fields' ability as a runner, and it's Garrett Wilson for the half a season that he was healthy. And Engstrand, to me, didn't really check those boxes as reliably as you want. Like, Hall had a good year, but as John Bushko talked about, like, they could have gotten a lot more out of him as a pass catcher. For example, Breece Hall took about 55% of the running back snaps on passing downs for the Jets this year, according to PFF. And you compare that to Bijan Robinson, who took about 80% of the running back snaps on passing downs for the Falcons this year. And that's exactly what John was talking about, whereas it's like they could be getting a lot more out of Breece Hall in the passing game, and they are choosing not to in favor of Isaiah Davis. Fields was used as a runner this past year with the Jets, but given the struggles of the offense, you would think that they would have leaned a little bit more on Fields as a runner compared to how he was utilized in Chicago, right? If you take out scrambles, Fields averaged about 6.1 design runs per game across his 2 full seasons as a starter in Chicago in 22 and 23. This year with the Jets, it was down to 4.8. So again, it's not a huge difference, but that's about a 20% difference, right? Even if it's only 1.3 design runs difference per game. Those are the kind of the margins. That 20% is kind of the margins that you want good play callers to be able to maximize. Now, Wilson, I think, was fine. He got injured, and that was probably a bigger issue than his utilization in offense, although you could probably nitpick it. So, but I would say, like, of those 3 boxes, Engstrand only really checked one of those 3 boxes in terms of maximizing the usage of the 3 sort of assets that the Jets did have. And you compare that to Zach Robinson, where if you did the same exercise and said, what are the 3 things that you need to do if you're building a successful Falcons offense, you're going to be like, feed Bijan, feed Drake, and feed Kyle Pitts. And Zach Robinson checked all 3 of those boxes. And then when you look at Engstrand's pass as a, only other pass as a play caller in the NFL, it was with the DC Defenders in the XFL in 2020. And they had like the second worst offense in the XFL that year, at least based off of points scored. And so, again, I know I'm coming off as a hater, but I just don't understand why people are hyping up this move, right? And these moves of like, oh, Tommy Rees and Alex Van Pelt, the new quarterbacks coach, Tanner Engstrand. Now, Van Pelt has a proven track record as a quarterbacks coach, so no shade at him there, but I've seen some people talking about his play calling experience, and it's like, all right, the 1 year, he's had 2 years of play calling experience, 09 with the Bills, 24 with the Patriots. They were both bottom 3 offenses, in both of those years. And it just feels like the Falcons are just collecting all the bad play callers that have been calling the worst offenses in the NFL the last couple of years with these 3 guys. And if they can get Chip Kelly, they can get Brian Callahan, Bill Sun, and Luke Getsy, like they'll have all the infinity stones of all the bad play callers that have existed in the NFL the last couple of years. And, I've seen this narrative that like the Falcons are bringing a lot more experience under Kevin Stefanski in terms of play calling to back up Tommy Rees than Raheem did with Zach Robinson. And it's like when you factor in Ken Zampese, who was the only guy that had play calling experience. Yeah, the Falcons only had 2 years of NFL play calling experience when Raheem built that initial staff and back in 2024. And now they have 4, if you don't count Stefanski, they have like 4.5 years of play calling experience, right? If you count the XFL between Rees, Van Pelt, and Engstrand. And that's more, but it's not substantially more. Now, Callahan brings a little bit more experience, but as far as I'm aware, the only year he's ever actually called plays was 2013 with the Cowboys, because I don't think he called plays under John Gruden with the Raiders. And so, when we talk about if this doesn't work, like the only thing that's saving the Falcons in terms of play calling experience is Kevin Stefanski with his 5 years of play calling experience, or 6 years, I guess, if you count the 2 half seasons in the last 2 years. And so, I've seen people bring up Engstrand's involvement in Detroit, but like, how much credit are we giving him for the Detroit offer? Like, we've seen what a Tanner Engstrand offense looks like without Ben Johnson. It's a bottom 5 offense. We've seen what a Ben Johnson offense looks like without Tanner Engstrand, still a top 10 offense. We've seen the Detroit Lions produce a top 10 offense without either of those guys. So like, what are we doing? And again, I know this is all hating, but I had a Locked On Falcons insider summarize this perfectly. And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider, you can join at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. But Aaron, no relation, basically said pretty much a bunch of guys who want to be able to say it wasn't their fault. If the offense is fine next year, they can basically say, I told you so. But if the offense sucks, then it's going to be a very bad look on Stefanski. Very risky, but we will see. And I think that perfectly summarizes what I'm talking about, where it's just like they're just collecting all these reclamation projects as far as play callers go. And it seems like we're just basically betting on, the Jets and the Browns, they didn't have any talent. And that's why these guys didn't get results these last couple of years. And that leads us to betting on the Falcons' talent, which is the same bet the Falcons have been making for 8 years, which is our talent is second to none. And that alone will produce positive results. And it hasn't produced positive results. It's produced middle of the road offenses and middling results over the last 8 years. And so that's where I just tend to be a little bit more skeptical. Now it's barely February. It's a long off season, but this is why I said last week, like nothing that the Falcons have done from a coaching standpoint, or very little, let's say that they've done from a Stefanski building his coaching staff has wowed me at this point in time. Now, sat here a year ago, not being enthusiastic about the Ulbrich hire. By the time we got to training camp, I was much higher on the Ulbrich hire, having studied the film and watched his defense and whatnot. And so hopefully these hires will grow on me similarly. And 6 months from now, we'll be like, yeah, we're good on that. And we'll continue to talk about that as we watch more film, as we talk to more people that have covered these guys, as this offseason unfolds. But again, like I know everybody else is like singing the praises of this, and of course Aaron's going to come on here and hate on these hires, but I'm just like, I just don't get the hype that people are trying to push this narrative of like, oh, we have a wealth of play calling experience in the building, and all these guys are going to work here in Atlanta because we are so much more talented than these other teams. And it's like, all right, man, I've seen that movie before, and we'll see if it works out for the Falcons. So it is, as Aaron, no relation, said, there's going to be an I told you so at the end, a year from now. And hopefully it will be the Atlanta Falcons saying, I told you so. This is going to be a good offense. I don't think it's going to be a bad offense. I don't think we're going to be a bottom 3 or bottom 5 offense this year. Let me make that clear. But feels like we're headed to another path to being middle of the road. But we'll see on that front. But, even though I'm not super optimistic about where the direction of the offense is going under the leadership of some of these new coaches, more optimistic. Super optimistic, I can't say. Nothing I'm super optimistic about when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, but more optimistic about where this Falcons pass rush could be headed under, the leadership of guys like James Pearce and Jaylen Walker, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the big game is almost here, and there's no better way to stay locked into every moment than with Prize Picks, the daily fantasy app, where it always feels good to be right. With football season in its final stretch, now's the perfect time to close it out strong. Build simple lineups around player projections with no drafts, no waiting, just football action all the way through the playoffs. Prize Picks is incredibly easy to get started. Just pick 2 or more less players and choose more or less on their projections. It's a great way to get that fantasy football vibe long after your season-long leagues have finished. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. Prize Picks, it is good to be right. And if you want to kick off the new year in the right way, hydration is probably the easiest win that you can have. When I know I stay on top of my hydration, my energy, my focus, my mood all level up. If you're looking to level up your hydration, you got to try Drip Drop, a doctor-developed proven fast hydration that helps your body and mind work better. It uses a precise ratio of electrolytes and glucose for rapid absorption, delivering 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of leading sports drink. And you got some great taste, 16 original flavors, 8 zero sugar flavors. I tried the 0 sugar watermelon this morning, and I know you guys can't tell that my mood is in a better place, but it absolutely is. This is the height of positivity that we have thanks to Drip Drop. So right now, Drip Drop is offering our podcast listeners 20% off your first order. Go to dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONNFL for 20% off. Stock up now at dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. So I spent this past week in Mobile, and, I know you guys that were watching the Senior Bowl practices, you probably missed this, but during a commercial break, they had to halt practice. And one of the coaches turned to me in the national practice and said, "Hey, you, where'd you get that sweet Locked On merch?" And I had to tell him that I got it. In order to get that sweet Locked On merch, you got to join the Everydayer Club, right? And all you got to do for $5 a month or $50 a year, you hit that link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, and you can get access to a merch store for some sweet Locked On merch, as well as get an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons and get premium exclusive Discord access. And they were like, oh, okay, cool. All right, back to practice. And, that's how it went down. But let's talk about these edge rushers. And let's talk about James Pearce, right? He got off to a fast start in week 1 and 2, taking advantage, I think, of the absence of guys like Tristan Wirfs and Christian Darrisaw, taking advantage of those backups. And then he kind of went quiet for like the next 5 or 6 games with a pressure rate under 8%. And for the sake of comparison, according to PFF, Matthew Judon's pressure rate in 2024 was 8%. Lorenzo Carter's career pressure rate was 9%. And then it was like, all right, well, that's fine for a rookie, And then James Pearce went off for those last 10 games. And he got 10 sacks in 10 games, 32 pressures, a 14% pressure rate. And it was a big breakthrough for Pearce. I broke it down for the insiders, and I think the big breakthrough for him was he was able to refine his pass rush with a much more vertical get off, which forces offensive tackles to have to overset. It creates a two-way go, especially when the Falcons utilize James Pearce as that ISO rusher in their 3x1 or overload fronts to try to create those one-on-one opportunities for him and feature him in that way. And hopefully he'll continue to build off of that going into the future, right? I think he still needs to refine his hands, time his hands a little bit better with some of the chops and swipes and whatnot that he is able to use. But he was able to hit a couple of those in the back half of the season. And if he can consistently start hitting those in the future, and it usually takes the better part of 2 or 3 years for guys to develop that in the NFL, so he's on track. I think he's going to be able to take his game to the next level in addition to the vertical speed rush that he is able to generate. Now, with James Pearce, he's probably not going to be ever a great run defender, but he does a decent job setting the edge. His issue is mostly he can set the edge and then he struggles to get off the block to make the plays. But that's fine, as a situational pass rusher or a DPR designated pass rusher, as long as he's productive as a pass rusher, you don't mind the fact that he's not going to necessarily be a huge impact in the run game. And we saw that manifest in the back half of the season where he was very productive in that role. And we'll hopefully see that continue. Now, I know some of you guys are wondering, Aaron, talk about the trade, because I joked earlier during the season that we wouldn't praise the James Pearce trade until after Terry Fontenot's been fired. And now that Terry Fontenot's been fired, you're like, okay, Aaron, now it's time for you to say the trade was a good one. And it's like, pump the brakes on that. I still don't like the trade. I think it was a bad process, even though I think JPJ is doing everything in his power to give us a positive result. But the reason why I think it's a bad process is because the Falcons thought that they were one piece away or, fixing their pass rush away from solving all their problems. And even though they did technically solve the pass rush problem with 57 sacks, a franchise record, the team as a whole was not one piece away. And the issue is that the Falcons continued, as they did the previous offseason with the quarterback position, continue to pour, 2 and 3 problems worth of assets into solving one problem. And it's not a sustainable way to build. And it's always going to be a bad process, if the Falcons approach it. Hopefully with Ian Cunningham, the new GM manager, they will have a very different process when it comes to those things. But I do think as long as James Pearce gives you positive results, it could overshadow that bad process in the long run. We're not there yet, despite James Pearce's rookie success. He needs to firmly establish himself as one of the 10 to 15 best edge rushers in the NFL. I think he's on the path there, but he's not quite there yet. So we'll see as he continues to grow as a player and will allow us to get positive results despite a very bad process to that trade. But talking about Jaylen Walker, we had a 3-game stretch in the middle of the season against Buffalo, Indianapolis, and New England. He missed the 49ers and Dolphins game where Jaylen Walker played lights out, right? He was elite during that stretch, and arguably he was better during that stretch than James Pearce was at any point during the season. But we'll let you people debate that in the comments or elsewhere. But he generated across those 3 games, 3 sacks, 12 pressures. He had a 20% pressure rate, which is an elite number, right? Micah Parsons' career pressure rate is 20%. And I believe it was like 20-ish% this year. The issue with Jaylen Walker, though, was outside of that 3-game stretch, his production was not that impressive, right? He had 2.5 sacks, 17 pressures across the other 12 games that he played this year. And that accounted for about an 8% pressure rate, which, as I mentioned earlier, is basically what Matthew Judon had last year. Now, it doesn't mean that Jaylen Walker was bad for those other 12 games. I think some of the lack of production was due to, accumulation of those soft tissue injuries that plagued Jaylen Walker throughout the calendar year of 2025, pre-draft, post-draft, and into the season. But I think even though his individual production was not incredible during those 12 games, Jaylen Walker was a extremely useful player in those 12 games, right? With Pearce, who's primarily good at pass rushing and doesn't add a whole lot else, Walker is capable of doing a lot more different things, right? Even if his individual production is not standing out, he's still a very useful player. Obviously, you see that with his ability as a run defender. We're not concerned about his ability to hold up on rundowns. The Falcons like to utilize him rushing over the guard a bunch, but they often like to utilize him in that way where they would drop him into coverage, and that would allow them to bring pressure from elsewhere, whether that was a linebacker, a safety, a corner, and it was very effective creating those opportunities for those other players to create pressure with some of that simulated looks that they were giving up front. And then on rare occasions, they did it maybe like 4 or 5 times the whole year, but they tried to line him up as a true off-ball linebacker and rush on some obvious passing downs. And even if Walker didn't himself make the play, it almost always resulted in a positive play for the defense because somebody else made the play, because Walker was essentially kind of freeing up a teammate to win his one-on-one. And so, that's what I mean, where he's like a very useful player, even if he isn't as an individual making all the plays. And I think Walker still needs work as a pass rusher, especially when he lines up over that guard. He was a much more effective rusher rushing from outside at edge than he was rushing inside, which is something that we thought was going to be the flip of that, given his evaluation. And I think part of that he wasn't as effective rushing inside was he wasn't as good as he needs, again, like James Pearce, he needs to refine his hands using those chops and swims that are going to be more effective against guards than they are going to be against tackles. But I think there's a lot of intriguing upside with Jaylen Walker, right? Where he can continue to be used in a multitude of ways that are going to enhance the defense, and if you can also count on him being more consistently winning his individual matchups like we saw during that 3-game stretch, regardless of where he lines up, that's where he's going to reach his full potential as a player. And that's going to be, an extremely valuable player for the Atlanta Falcons defense, right? That his presence on the field is going to make his teammates better. And then he himself making plays is obviously going to make the defense better. And now, last tidbit we'll say before moving on and talking about the rest of the edge rusher room, there is a conversation about the potential of Jaylen Walker moving full-time to an off-ball linebacker spot. I think that is still technically on the table, although it's unlikely to happen in 2026. But a lot of that will kind of depend on how the Falcons treat their linebacker needs this offseason, and we'll get more into that as the week unfolds. But in a world where they re-sign Caden Ellis and are more focused on let's get a depth option on day 3 of the draft, I do think that's a world where the linebacker move is still on the table, even if it's not on the table in 2026. That is a move down the road because the Falcons will still probably be looking for a younger linebacker to be the long-term answer at that spot. And Walker could potentially fill those shoes. However, if the Falcons do draft a linebacker, particularly with one of their premium picks on day 2 in the 2nd or 3rd round, and they ultimately hit on that pick, and that player also has a productive rookie season like Walker and Pearce had this past year, that likely is going to prevent Walker from making that move down the road and allow him to stick at edge. So if you want Jaylen Walker to stay as an edge rusher and stay in his current role, then you want the Falcons to prioritize drafting a linebacker, I think, as opposed to re-signing Caden Ellis. But, I think it's at this point still something that's on the back burner, but I think it's still an option down the road until it's not an option when the Falcons ultimately get, multiple linebackers that are good. They were like, oh, well, we don't need Jaylen Walker to play linebacker because we have 3 or 4 guys that can do that job pretty ably. But despite the success of Pearce and Walker, edge is still a potential need for this football team due to the potential departures of some free agents like Arnold, Ebiketie, and Leonard, Floyd, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it's a new year and new systems, and that's not just for the Atlanta Falcons, but it's for everyone, because this is the time when a lot of us look at the messier parts of how we run our business and think, there's got to be a better way. And there is. Streamlining your communications is one of the quickest upgrades that you can make, and that's why today's episode is brought to you by Quo, spelled Q-U-O, the smarter way to run your business communications, because when your team is reachable, organized, and communicating in one place, you're not just working cleaner, you're creating more opportunities to connect with customers. Your whole team can call and text from one shared business number, so nothing gets missed. Everyone sees the full conversation thread, which makes replies faster and more personal. It's no surprise that Quo is the #1 rated business phone system on G2, trusted by more than 90,000 businesses, from solo operators to growing teams. So make this the year where no opportunity and no customer slips away. Try Quo for free, plus get 20% off your first 6 months when you go to quo.com/lockedonnfl. That's QUO.com/lockedonnfl. Quo, no missed calls and no missed customers. With the football season almost over, I know you're going to miss the crowd noise, the energy, and cheering alongside your fellow fans. Being in the stadium just hits different. But don't worry, you can still get that fixed by heading back to your local NBA arena. If you're looking to score tickets fast, Game Time is your go-to app. They take the hassle out and give the advantage back to where it belongs with the fans. Open the app, and within minutes, you can have your tickets for an upcoming Hawks game locked in. I know you're locked on, but why not be locked in with Game Time? What you see is what you get. The price you see is the price you pay. No hidden fees at checkout. Plus, you can preview your seat before you buy, so there are no surprises. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today, and remember, it's Game Time. It's GameTime.co, not .com. So when we talk about the rest of the edge rusher room, I don't expect Arnold Ebiketie to be back in Atlanta in 2026. I think Leonard Floyd at this point is a maybe. From reading between the lines of some in-season tweets from AK, it sounded like he wanted or expected to get traded at the trade deadline. That didn't happen. And essentially he took it personally because basically after the trade deadline, starting from week 9, that same stretch of 10 games where James Pearce went off, AK kind of went off as well, even though he didn't have the sack production that James Pearce had, right? And so it got overlooked. But you look at AK's pressure rate from week 9 through week 18, it was 21%. Again, an elite rate. More pressures, a higher pressure rate than Micah Parsons had, this past season. But he only had 2 sacks, so no one really cared. Even though his sack per snap rate was virtually the same as it was last year during that 10-game stretch where he had 6 sacks. And so the real issue with AK this past year was he was limited by snaps. And I expect him to, take his talents elsewhere where he'll get more opportunities to get on the field. I would imagine he's going to sign a short-term prove-it deal with somebody else, and it probably will be at a price tag low enough that it actually is worthwhile for the Falcons to try to re-sign him. Again, I'm guessing somewhere between like a 1 or 2 year deal averaging $5 to $10 million a year. But since it takes 2 to tango, I don't expect Arnold Ebiketie to want to dance with the Falcons at this point in time. Now, with Leonard Floyd, I do think it's a little bit more realistic that he could return. He's been signing these 1-year mercenary contracts for the past few years, and I certainly think Atlanta is a real possibility to re-up on a similar deal, probably for less than the $10 million that he signed on that 1-year deal last year. I know Jarvis has been very critical of Leonard Floyd on Falcon Squad shows as well as Locked on Falcons episodes. I don't really agree with that. I think particularly during the third quarter of the season when he came back from those injuries that limited him in the middle of the year, I thought Floyd played his best ball. I actually think Floyd was much better this past year in Atlanta than he was the previous year in San Francisco. He certainly exceeded my expectations. So I don't really have a lot negative to say about Leonard Floyd. I think he got better this past year and was a much more productive producer of pressure than he was, necessarily racking up a huge amount of sacks. But should both of these guys walk in free agency, the challenge is going to be how will the Falcons try to replace them, if at all, right? Now, if they can finally get Braylon Trice healthy, who's missed the last 2 seasons due to injury, presumably, an ACL tear in 24, and from what I understand, a subsequent ACL tear in 25, but we didn't get official confirmation of that from Raheem Morris, as we never get any official confirmation of anything from Raheem Morris when it comes to injuries. If Braylon Trice does come back healthy this year for the first time ever, that will definitely mitigate some of the concerns with the depth behind Walker and Pearce. D'Angelo Malone deserves a mention here. He's also an impending free agent. I'm assuming the Falcons are going to let him walk. Khalid Kareem is an impending free agent. My guess is that he'll probably be the most likely of this quartet of edge rushers between Ebiketie, Floyd, Malone, and Kareem to get re-signed. I think it will be likely that he'll get re-signed. Zach Harrison having a healthy return coming off his knee injury will also help mitigate some of the concerns. And according to Next Gen Stats, he had about 60% of his snaps lined up at D tackle this year, 40% at edge. I could imagine if the Falcons lean more on a 4-3 front as their base defense rather than the 3-4 front that they did last year, that we could see that split flip, right? If you compare John Franklin Myers, similar role, similar player, with his usage in New York under Jeff Ulbrich in 22 and 23, he had about a 75-25 edge to D tackle split in terms of his alignment, according to Next Gen Stats. So I think those edge snaps could go up for Zach Harrison and add his value as a run defender there. Some of that could depend on what the Falcons do at D tackle as well. But I say, as we sit here right now, if you're looking at who are the 4 best pass rushers on the Falcons currently under contract, it's Pearce, Walker, Brandon Dorlus, and Zach Harrison. So we could see, if that remains the case, for the next 6 months as we gear up for the season, we could see a lot of Zach Harrison as an interior pass rusher on passing down. So scheme will matter, and the rest of the roster will matter and play a part in that as well. But I certainly think the Falcons should be looking to add to their edge room, trying to find someone that can also add some value as a run defender, but also bring some juice as a pass rusher to bolster their rotation. It's obviously not a priority. And given the limited resources the Falcons have from a draft standpoint, it wouldn't be shocked if the Falcons ignore it. And once again, shout out to Terry Fontenot by constantly putting the Falcons behind the 8 ball, which is why he's bad. Edge is no longer a pressing need thanks to the additions of Walker and Pearce, but this team would no doubt benefit from having more draft picks so that they could continue to bolster their pass rush, with a middle round edge rusher to help avoid regression, because regression is going to be a concern for this team, right? 57 sacks. This will be something that we'll talk about more as the offseason unfolds. But, I looked it up. If you go back to 2020 to 2024 and all the defenses that had a sack rate above 9%, which the Falcons had this past year, there have been 7 such defenses prior to this season. 5 of those teams saw significant regression the following year. The 2 exceptions were the 24 Broncos and the 2020 Steelers. And 4 out of the 5 teams that regressed, notably, they had a defensive coordinator change. The one that didn't was the 23 Kansas City Chiefs, who went from 57 sacks in 2023 to 39 sacks in 2024. So I do think retaining Jeff Ulbrich helps mitigate some of the concerns about the regression. But again, this will be a topic that we'll unpack as we get more information across the offseason. And the last thing I'll say on that is I think it'll be easy to look at the sack production of some of the players that the Falcons might lose, like Ellis and Leonard Floyd and Ebiketie and David Onyemata, and be like, oh, well, they're only losing like 10 to 12 sacks, right? But because sack production is so volatile and pressure is not, right? Like the Falcons were 4th in sack rate this year. They were 15th in pressure rate. And so it's more likely that the Falcons 2026 defense will be much more closer to the middle of the pack, which is still roughly around 40 sacks. So we're not going to complain about that here in Atlanta. But, I think far too often people think production and development is linear. It's like, oh, well, James Pearce had 10 sacks as a rookie, so he'll have 15 in his sophomore year. Jaylen Walker had 5 sacks as a rookie, he'll have 10 sacks in his sophomore year. And it's like, that certainly could happen, but that's not guaranteed. That's, that's a dart throw at best. And so that's why we will talk about it. But tomorrow we'll talk about the D tackles, as well as any other coaching moves that the Falcons may make in the next 24 hours. We may explore a little bit more deeply into Alex Van Pelt tomorrow as well. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL to get you guys geared up for this weekend's big game, as well as check out the link in the description below if you want to get this sweet Locked On merch. At the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, $5 a month, $50 a year, as well as other perks. Check it out. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.